All right. Welcome to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. My name is Jared Mello. Today we're going to go over narcissistic fleas. But a couple announcements. One, next Tuesday, February 18th, I'll be interviewing Dr. George Simon. February 20th, which is Thursday, I'll be talking to HG Tudor again. Any specific questions, I might make a post about this, but if you want to see me ask them anything, let me know and I'll make that post. So keep an eye out for that post. But let's get into narcissistic fleas here. What are narcissistic fleas? Narcissistic fleas are when someone starts to develop some of the behaviors of a narcissist, or they start to say some of the same things and they catch themselves doing some of the same things sometimes. This is much different than actually having NPD as well. But this happens for a couple of different reasons. One, we become like the people we surround ourselves with, and that's true for anyone. But it's especially true with a narcissist because in that case, when they are devaluing someone, abusing someone, being really critical, condescending, antagonistic, etc., it has a lasting effect. And often if someone is in a trauma bond with them, then they can develop cptsd. Now, some of the common times that people develop narcissistic fleas are if they had a narcissistic parent. If you have a narcissistic parent growing up and your primary caregiver, one or both, is narcissistic, you could develop narcissistic fleas. This is different than having full-blown NPD. And the reason for this is, as Dr. Salerno and I have addressed, narcissism, 78% heritability. The other 22%, of which some of it includes childhood trauma, but that part's different. You can't develop narcissism as an adult. It is something that you either have those inherent traits when you're born or you do not. And then once you have those inherent traits, then they can often be triggered by events down the line. But even if they're not triggered by anything, you can still become a narcissist anyway. And this becomes evident when you see people that had a great childhood, but then they're still character disordered. They still develop NPD. How does that happen? Well, they had that biological component. You look at the twin studies, the proof is there in those twin studies. Somebody commented on one of the videos I did with Dr. Salerno, and that's what they mentioned. But if you have a narcissistic parent, you can develop narcissistic fleas. Narcissistic fleas can be a symptom of cptsd, and you might catch yourself saying similar things, being really defensive or critical perhaps. But again, this is different than being a narcissist. Another way this can come out is if you have a romantic relationship with a narcissist. You have a tumultuous up and down relationship with them, and then over time, you can develop narcissistic fleas. And it happens because you become like that person. And then it can be a symptom of being in a trauma bond with them and a symptom of cptsd. And it's something that, and this is the key here, if you can be aware of it, simply being aware of having narcissistic fleas and then trying to do something about it, that's more than half the battle. People who are truly character disordered with NPD, they don't really care. Like, they don't care that they act this way. Their impaired empathy and their lack of conscience, they don't even stop to think twice. Oh, maybe I screwed that person over back there. Maybe that wasn't so good. I wonder what I should do about that. Instead, it's all about just defending themselves, externalizing blame. And when someone does that, they're not going to grow. You can't grow if your first instinct is to always externalize blame. And that includes playing the victim too. If you play the victim, you're not going to grow either. So in these kinds of situations here with narcissistic fleas, being aware that you can even have them is humongous. And then what do? You learn how to take a step back and respond rather than react. And this is true for everyone, honestly. This is what developing emotional maturity is all about. You don't say the first thing that comes to your mind. You say, okay, I got to pause, take a step back. It might even require you taking a break from the conversation, but then you think it over, you let your emotions get back under control, and then you try to come back with a healthy response. This is what narcissistic people certainly don't do. They get that emotional dysregulation, and then they fly off the handle. And they say the first thing that comes to their mind, doesn't matter how hurtful, harmful, ridiculous, childish, or immature it is, they just, poof, they go. The other part of this whole dynamic with narcissistic fleas is it's important to go over toxic behaviors are not the same as narcissistic traits. Two very different things. And why is that? A toxic behavior is something like lying, or maybe being selfish, or being overly negative. That's a toxic behavior. Anyone could do a toxic behavior regardless of any kinds of diagnoses or labels they may have. Anyone can do toxic behaviors. Narcissistic traits, on the other hand, that's a completely different story. Now, narcissistic traits, they have to be a part of someone's personality inherently, and they have to be persistent and pervasive over many areas of their life. So, examples of narcissistic traits. These are things like feelings of grandiosity and superiority, a sense of entitlement, hypersensitivity to criticism, a lack of empathy, exploitation of others in their interpersonal relationships, and being envious of others as well. And they have to be persistent and pervasive over many areas of life for it to truly be a narcissistic trait. And that's how a narcissist gets diagnosed. They go to a psychiatrist or maybe even a therapist, and then they have to observe. And if they can determine that, wow, they got 5 of the 9 traits of narcissism, and they are persistent and pervasive over many areas of their life, they could be diagnosed with NPD. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, there's severe cases of NPD, and then there's less severe cases. But you could argue, does a less severe case, would they always qualify for NPD? I'm not sure about that. That's something that I would ask Dr. Simon or Dr. Salerno. But in terms of narcissistic traits, this is why it's not true to say everyone has narcissistic traits, because not everyone has a lack of empathy persistently and pervasively over many areas of life. Not everyone has feelings of grandiosity and superiority persistently and pervasively over many areas of life. Not everyone's exploitative persistently and pervasively over many areas of life. You get the hint here. So that's why it's important to make that distinction. Now, everyone has wants, everyone has needs. So I've heard H.G. Tudor say, for example, that he believes everyone has narcissistic traits. This might be something that we go over, because I would say what I just said. And I'd be curious what his explanation is for why he says that. He might really just mean toxic behaviors. I'm not sure. But I think he says, like, everyone has the need to control certain things, and that's a narcissistic trait. But I guess that's what I would push back against, because just like everyone has needs, everyone would want to control certain things. Like, people want to control their finances. People want to control maybe their household, perhaps. But does that mean it's a narcissistic trait? I would say no. I don't think that's the same thing. But it's important to recognize these differences to get our language down, because, like I said before, I have used the word codependency wrong before. I had used it as someone who is with a narcissist is probably codependent. But that's not true. It's not necessarily true. It could be more someone who is dependent. That's a different story. Being dependent is different than codependent. Dependence with narcissists, they fit together like a toxic puzzle piece. But codependency, they are people that were codependent on a substance, and there was an alcoholic or an addict they were in a relationship with, and the term codependent was used to describe their codependency on that substance. And you see, that's a much different use of the term. That's a different definition than how you see a lot of people use it today. But what we really mean, what people would really mean when they say codependent, is maybe self-love deficiency, or maybe someone who can be a people pleaser or who has weak boundaries. But those are different things. But I also like the term caretaking. And caretaking versus caregiving are also two different things. Caretaking is the one that can have an element of control in it. And this is where parents that can be neurotic, they can also be controlling a little bit too, but it's not as much from the character disordered side. It might not be narcissistic, but they can neurotically want to control because they want to care give. They falsely believe if they can just control others, they will feel okay on the inside. They're not character disordered, but it's the neurotic version of controlling. It's something I'm going to go over with Dr. Simon as well, this neurotic versus character disorder distinction. He is one of the first people I saw talk about this. It has fallen out of favor, though. The terms character disorder and neurotic have kind of fallen out of favor. But Dr. Salerno thinks they're still as relevant as ever. And I can completely understand why. But that's something to pay attention to as well. So, but if you have narcissistic fleas out there, one, I applaud you for even being able to recognize it, because not everyone can recognize it. Not everyone has that self-awareness. But if you do have the self-awareness and you see it in yourself, good job. And then what I would recommend is paying attention to where they come out. Like, what kinds of situations do they come out in? Is it in certain times? Is it with certain people? Is it in certain situations? What is it? Because getting to the bottom of that would be really important too. And maybe it's if you feel criticized. Maybe it's if you feel misunderstood. Maybe if someone tries to address something with you, or maybe you get impatient with others and they come out. I don't know what it is. It's just going to depend on each individual person. And a lot of it will depend on what the narcissist was like in your life. Like, you're going to develop the narcissistic fleas more than likely of the behaviors the narcissist you were with did. So if they were really critical and belittling and antagonistic, chances are that could possibly be one of the narcissistic fleas you pick up doing that. And again, this is much different than narcissistic personality disorder. They are two different things. Narcissistic fleas is just behaviors. It is not the full-blown disorder. They don't have that lack of empathy, more than likely. The brain is going to be different. People who have NPD, their brain is different. It's a whole different ball game. But this is something that I see people talk about a lot, and they think, oh no, can I develop NPD from being with a narcissist? No, you can't develop NPD. And even a TBI, traumatic brain injury, that is not the same as NPD either. Like, some of the symptoms of that could mimic NPD in some cases, but that is not the same as having narcissistic personality disorder. It is not the same as having those inherent traits that are needed to develop NPD. Not the same in any way. But again, you can't develop this later on as an adult. It's either you have those inherent traits or you don't. And it's really just that cut and dry with it. If it could be, there's possibilities that it's also something else. People can develop into a jerk. People can develop into an ass. People can develop into something that mimics cptsd, or maybe a cptsd, but that's different. So it's either you have it or you don't. You can't catch it. It's not contagious. The closest thing to it is narcissistic fleas. And then once you recognize it, then you can try to do something about it. Then you can try to, and this is where it starts with us too. Our mind, body, spirit will be humongous. And for me, this is what I've learned. The better I am with my mental health and my mind, body, spirit, the better I'm going to be able to communicate and the more emotionally regulated I am. As I mentioned the other day, I'm on the spectrum. I've had anxiety. I've had depression. But I'm just super grateful I have found a supplement routine that really manages a lot of this, so that the things that used to come up don't come up nearly as much anymore. But it's also humbling at the same time, because if I lose my routine, a lot of those negative symptoms would come back, and that is scary to think about. But as of now, I'm grateful I have found it. But when I'm doing good, that's when it's more likely I'm going to be emotionally regulated. I'm going to be able to respond rather than react. I'm going to be less negative, less critical of others, less defensive. Especially as a content creator, that comes out a lot too, where if I'm in a good place, you might get some hate, you might get some harsh criticism, you might get someone being antagonistic, etc. But when I'm in a good place, it doesn't bother me. If I'm not in a good place, on the other hand, then I'm a little more likely to be bothered. I'm a little more likely to get upset. But either way, when I see comments like that, it's an opportunity. I think, oh, what's the opportunity here? Is it an opportunity for me to practice emotional self-control? Is it an opportunity for me to kind of think of another video idea? Is it an opportunity for me to engage as long as they're not like truly being bad faith? Maybe I can learn something from the interaction. You never know. But those are things to pay attention to as well, because not every interaction is going to be worth it. My rules of thumb for that are, if they are extremely antagonistic and it seems like they're just trying to get under my skin, there's no point to that. There is no point in doing that at that point. Just let it go. The best response is no response in that area. But again, a lot of it will depend. So sometimes I will try to engage with those kinds of people. Other times I won't. But it starts with us. So if you have narcissistic fleas, I would say you got to do something different probably too. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes. Maybe you have to go to EMDR. Maybe you have to treat your trauma in some way. Maybe you have to remember to like hang out with friends more, or do something different with your diet or your sleep routine, etc. I don't know. It's really hard to say in just a general way, because what's going to help everyone is going to be so much different. It really depends on each individual situation. But one thing I will say is eliminating bad habits. That's something that I can say to everybody. So if you're in the habit of maybe binge drinking on the weekends, well, that's probably going to have some negative effects. It's probably going to hurt your emotional regulation. It's probably going to dysregulate your whole being. And it's not really good for your physical body either. Now, granted, I'm not completely against drinking, but as I get older, it just doesn't mesh well with me anymore. So I rarely do it now. But it's an example of a self-inflicted wound. Like if somebody drinks, then they can kind of get what they get, and they're going to be a little off. Tim Ferriss has said drinking is like trading tomorrow's happiness for today. And I could absolutely see that for sure. But there's other examples, like sometimes cigarettes or vaping, maybe even gambling. Gambling all depends on the individual, though. Some people are a little more tolerant of it than others. Me, I can get a little manic from gambling, and then I can kind of be, it can appear like a bipolar type 2, where I can be manic and then I can crash. And then I notice myself being more sensitive to criticism, and then I can be a little more sensitive to rejection as well. So my system can be pretty sensitive. But again, I'm just super grateful I have found anything that really helps me for the very most part. I just have to walk a narrow path. Now, maybe you could ask, do I have narcissistic fleas? No, I mean, I've probably had some narcissistic traits where, because back in the day, I had the opposite of narcissistic traits, right? I had no self-worth, no feelings of grandiosity or superiority. I might have been a little sensitive to criticism. And sometimes people on the spectrum, they can lack empathy sometimes too. And I know that's controversial to say, but I have seen that be the case. So if you have a lack of empathy, that can appear narcissistic, but it's very different. It's still different, because an autistic person, they're usually not as verbally fluent, but again, not always. It really depends. It's hard to make blanket statements. And a lot of times they're not going to get that grandiosity either. But those are the things that I've noticed. And for me, those other things, the autism, addiction, and anxiety, I've had to do a lot of work on myself because of those things. And the path I have to walk is pretty narrow. The older I get, the more narrow it gets, because I know myself now. I'm super sensitive to anything external, especially like supplements. God forbid, like anything mind and mood altering. I have a very set routine, like certain amount of coffee a day, my supplement routine. I have to work out 3 to 4 times a week. I have to sleep well, or just they're not going too well for me. So I have a very structured routine. You might even go as far as to say rigid, which I know it could be a problem, but I'm just glad I have something that works for me. But I can be rigid with it sometimes, and that's not always good. I can be a little inflexible. And when you're inflexible, it becomes more difficult to deal with life's challenges because life has a way of coming at you. Life has a way of coming at you and surprising you. So if you're rigid, you might have problems with that. You might get upset when the wind blows the wrong way and then something unexpected happens and you have to deal with it on the fly. Then it's tough. And when do these situations come up? If you have a family, if you're in a work environment and you have to deal with obstacles as they come up, those are the places those things come up. So again, those are the ways that when I notice myself getting rigid, I try to say, okay, I don't want to get too rigid here for those reasons. Johnny says, I married a covert narc. The control is very different with him. How so? Or how in your case? Because with a covert narcissist, it really just means that the traits are going to be covert. So they have the grandiosity, they have the lack of empathy, hypersensitivity to criticism, entitlement, exploitation, envious, but they come out covertly. So I would guess probably passive aggressive, some silent treatments, some guilt tripping, things along those lines, if I had to guess. But yeah, I mean, and those are the things, like those are good examples of what could be narcissistic fleas too for people. If someone catches themselves doing a silent treatment or guilt tripping when they don't get their way. If you had a covert narcissist parent and that's what they did, they guilt tripped you when they didn't get their way or you didn't do what they wanted you to do. That could be a narcissistic flea. Absolutely. In that case, you catch yourself saying a passive aggressive jab or a subtle dig. Yeah, that's a narcissistic flea for sure. So Charlie says, I married a covert narc. The control is very different with him. And then he says, everything, especially manipulation, hot, cold manipulation, reputation destruction, and she does it with the kids. Yeah, I mean, the hot and cold dynamic is very common. Hot and cold, which is one day things are great. They can give you some love bombing, some idealization. Things are going golden. And then it can turn to black. And then they can belittle, put you down, insult you, criticize you, etc. And the reputation destruction, that part's really crappy to me because it's so disrespectful. It is so disrespectful to do a smear campaign like that against someone, especially someone you're supposed to care about and love. What? It's like, it's just, and that's one of the examples of I practice radical self-respect today. And if someone ever dreamed of doing that stuff to me, I would just never talk to them again so fast. Like I couldn't even imagine it. But again, I was there. I was there and I put up with all sorts of stuff. And in my case, it was a covert narc too that I was with romantically. And with her, she would just like go. Like, and she just wouldn't respond to things and you just wouldn't hear from her. And she would come up with stories. She loved telling stories. Good. I'm glad you're no contact now. Some of the stories that I had heard, like they love fabricating things. Like they're fiction writers. And the one woman, she was saying things like she had a guy friend pick her up from the airport, a guy that almost certainly was sleeping with her. But what she had said was, oh, someone smashed our windshield and we spent the whole night looking for who did it. And it's like, what? You did what? Like, no, you just slept with this guy. 99% likely that you did that. But they can't say that, of course. And they couldn't just say, like, oh, we went home and did nothing. Couldn't say that either. They had to come up with a story. And so they told a massive story. And they liked it. They liked the discomfort. And I remember another time she was showing me pictures on her phone. And there was a picture of a guy with his arm around her. And then she acted like she was all embarrassed about it. But she really wasn't embarrassed. She just wanted to see me squirm a little bit. She wanted to see me jealous because she got some enjoyment from seeing me jealous and upset. And another video I'm going to do in the future, the differences between a narcissistic woman and a borderline woman, how they triangulate. Because they absolutely triangulate for different reasons a lot of times, but the behaviors can definitely look similar. Ex-wife literally to the letter. So predictable, even the stories. Yep. It's just like, the thing about the narcissistic women is I can't even idealize them at all anymore because it was just fake. Like the love bombing, the future faking, the you're so hot, you're so this. It wasn't real. And for me, that helped me get through it. Understanding that it wasn't real helped me get through it. And when I understood it wasn't real, then I couldn't see them in a positive light anymore. And then the power was gone. That disempowered them in my mind. I was able to see through it. Now, with borderline women, the case for borderline women is it's a little more real because they can be a little more genuine, but they're absolutely toxic as well. It just comes out in a different way. It's not as fake. Like they can still do some of the same things for sure, but to me, it's a little more genuine. Their problems are their fear of abandonment and their push-pull, that kind of thing. That's the borderline's problem. But I think it's just more real. The narcissist is just fake, fraudulent. I'm 60 years old now. I'm number 8 in a family of 9. I have no contact with an older sister. The abuse I experienced from this sister was horrible and continued in adulthood. And that's a big thing. Back then, my dad was from a family of 9. I don't know, like from 2025, I think to myself, how the hell did they all afford that back then? Are you kidding? I don't know how they did. So your older sister. And what would they do? I guess they would belittle and criticize you for supply, I guess. Hopefully you were able to go no contact with this person and you don't have to see her anymore, especially as a sister, or hopefully only at family functions. Yeah. I mean, it's sad because I certainly didn't think it was fake at the time. I thought the person was going to be someone I married. I was like, and that's the only time in my life I had ever thought that. I was like, oh my goodness, this is the one, the soulmate. And looking back now, it's like obvious now. But yeah, I wasn't happy on my own. I wanted someone to make me feel better about myself. So I was susceptible. I was susceptible to love bombing at the time. And she exploited it. So, but that's what I learned from it. I learned I can't do that. Good. And that's important because you don't need that. You don't need an older sister treating you that way. And people don't think about the siblings as much, especially brother-sister dynamic. Now, I wonder, though, in that case, is there narcissistic parents in there, too? More than likely there was. But not always. Not always. Sometimes it can really just skip them, and a sister can get it. Good. And it just depends. She put me in unsafe situations, called me names, and much more. It sounds like she probably got some like sadistic pleasure out of that. Maybe some duper's delight or something like that. And it's real. People don't even, unless they've seen it, they probably wouldn't believe it. Some of the things they do is like so out of control and childish. If you don't know any better, I know better. I know what it is. And it still can be like amazing to me how far they'll go, how ridiculous they'll go, how childish they'll go. It can really be out of control. But they go to no, there's no limit. There's no limit to how low they will go. And again, when it comes to narcissistic supply, it's different sometimes for women. Because, like, as a guy, a lot of narcissistic guys, a big thing they go after is sex, money, power. Understandable. And that's like the big payoff for them. They're going to get either money to power to sex. With women, it's a little different because there are some women that are really into men and they love all that attention and admiration. And this is where, with a somatic narcissist, they're the ones that are really into their appearance and their image. Things like Instagram they love that. The somatic narcissists, they love things like Instagram, especially women now, because they can just post Instagram, get all sorts of attention, admiration, and acknowledgement, narcissistic supply. And these are the women that they might be doing an OnlyFans. They might be doing some sort of other thing like that. And they love it. They love it. And unfortunately, they can make a small fortune doing it too. And I get annoyed when I see dudes spending money on that because I think, man, every cent you spend on that, just put it in Bitcoin or put it in the S&P 500. That'd be a better use of the money. Yeah, luckily for me, I didn't really have a narcissistic sibling. I've had a younger sibling that's a little dysregulated, we'll say. He can be like a crankopotamus, but it's a different dynamic because he's younger. But older siblings, they can really be brutal. Because when you grow up with somebody, even just like a 2-3 year age gap can feel like an eternity when you're 5. Like, think about that. When you're 5 years old and you have an older sibling that's 8, that kid is almost 50% older than you. Because when you're 5 years old, 1 year represents 1/5 of your life. And this is why, as we get older, the time goes by faster as well, because 1 year represents less and less of our lives as we get older, which is an interesting way to see it. I learned that from Sam Harris. Yeah, siblings are no fun. I mean, and there's certain people in the family, like the family is the main supply unit. So I've seen examples where a lot of times there'll be a business at the top. So there'll be a narcissistic mother or a narcissistic father. They run a business. And so there's a family business. And a lot of the kids and other people in the family, they're going to be vying for that main narcissist approval, to be in favor. And sometimes maybe they want to take over the business one day. Or maybe they just want preferential treatment because that narcissistic parent has power. And they can give jobs out. They can give money out. And it's interesting. Like, there's many different versions of these narcissistic dynamics. The family ones, very similar to a cult. Who would she triangulate you with? Other siblings or parents or cousins? That could be a big thing too. But I've seen that in the family dynamics that I'm familiar with. They know who they can mistreat. So there's certain people that they want to look good for, and they really know how to kiss butt. And when you know who they are and how they really can be, it is so obnoxious to see how fake they can be, to kiss the right person's butt. But then, if they think you can't do anything for them, then they'll treat you terribly. Yeah, I mean, when there's 9, it's a lot. 9 siblings is a lot. I know my dad's, like I said, my dad's family had 9 siblings. And there was certainly some chaos in there. Because my granddad, my dad's dad, he had left the family when he was about 12. My dad was 12 when he left. And actually, now that I mention it, something interesting Meredith Miller told me. When I was 12, I went with my dad to go see his dad at the hospice, and he passed away. And I was telling Meredith Miller this, and she had said to me, "Oh wow, so your granddad, he was faced with a boy, me, 12 years old, someone that was the same age as my dad when he left the family." And I had never thought of it like that before. But Meredith Miller was absolutely right about that. So, because I remember, I'll never forget it. I was in the hospice and I went up to him. And then, like, because he was hardly even there. But then his eyes perked up when he saw me. And then when Meredith Miller said that, I was like, oh, it probably makes sense. Like, imagine that. If you leave your family. Now, granted, I don't know. Maybe my grandmother might have had something to do with that too. So I don't want to just demonize him at all. I could be wrong. I don't know the situation. But when I came up there, his eyes were wide open. And then he's confronted with, wow, this is how old like my son was when I left. And I didn't see him for years. Because it's one thing to leave if you're fighting with the mother. But it's another thing to go away and not look back. It's another thing to not see your kids for years. But, my dad really had to grow up fast. And so I'm proud of my dad in that way. Like, he was in his low 20s and he became an airline mechanic. And he met my mother at 24. And I'm 39 and I'm thinking to myself, man, like when I was 23, I probably wasn't ready for that stuff. And I have other issues, of course, but it's helped me to put things in perspective. It's like, man, I would have been super stressed too if I had 3 kids by the time I was 30 and my mom wasn't working. So like, yeah, my dad could be mean and critical, etc. But when I think of it that way now, what would I have been like? What would I have been like if I was trying to make ends meet and had 3 kids by 30? Again, it's not an excuse. It's just a way to understand it so I can be in a better place with it today. Because what else would we want to do if not be in a good place today? That's the big thing. I want to be the happiest and healthiest version of myself today. So how do I look at things to do that? What's the best way for me to look at things to be the happiest and healthiest version of myself? That's what matters. And like anything else, I don't see the value in that. And I don't want to invalidate people by saying that. I'm not saying to do an ostrich routine. I'm not saying to dismiss it or pretend like it didn't happen, but see it in a way that you have to so that you can live today. Because what's the point of not doing that? What's the point of not doing that? And that's why I see the benefit in some of the toxic positivity people. And I see the benefit of the people who really emphasize like pointing out the toxic behaviors. I think there's a time for both, but the right place is kind of in the middle. You acknowledge the bad, but then you try to see things in a way that you grow through. The problem the toxic positivity folks run into is they can't do it without invalidating and being a jerk. And maybe it's because they just don't have the emotional maturity to do so, or maybe they don't have the words to articulate it. But that's the problem I see with them. With the people who just emphasize the toxic behaviors and all the ways that your parents fell short, to me, they need a little more of that solution stuff. And that's the thing that they're missing. They can get caught up in this the woe's me victim. Like, oh, my parents were so bad. My parents were emotionally dysregulated. My parents weren't there for me. My parents did this. My parents did that. And again, sometimes the things they did were pretty bad. Absolutely. And there can be times of SA for sure. But the interesting thing, when I interviewed Lisa Rogers, she's had some of that from a stepdad, SA. But she also is someone that really does not like victim mentality at all. Like, she's grown through it. And I found that some of the people that have had the worst experiences, they're the ones that don't like the victim mentality at all. Like, and maybe I have a biased sample. I'm only seeing the people that have done well. But a lot of them, because maybe they're doing something similar to me. They found a way. And I don't think that's a coincidence. It's like the people that you see are doing good. How did they do it? Because if you think like them, if you do what they do, you might be able to get similar results. And if you don't like where someone is, well, then that's something to pay attention to. What is their mindset? What is their attitude? How are they living? Because whatever it is, might not be the best. So here's an example. Even though there were 9 children, I had the first grandchild. When she found out she lost it and said, I can't believe she is having the first grandchild, she said she was so she felt envious. You were stealing the spotlight from her. She wanted to be the person with the first child. She constantly plays the victim. Yep. So you stole the spotlight from her. And I've seen this dynamic too, where people will have kids with someone, and if they're trying to get like the approval of the parents, like the husband or wife's parents, like it's really important to them they get all of that attention, the attention and admiration. And it sounds like that's what your sister wanted. That's what she wanted. She wanted that. Oh, look at you. Because, the first grandchild, that's a thing. It's definitely a thing where they'll get probably treated a little bit differently. But you stole her thunder, and she did not like that one bit. So it's fascinating. And if it wasn't so painful, it would be more fascinating, but it is still interesting to me. I'm still hearing about all of the dynamics. Very interesting. And that's why some of this stuff can be like entertainment too, because it can be so validating hearing about the things that you've been through. Like, oh, you might not realize there's a lot of people who have gone through something similar. So that has been one of the cool things for me. But I mean, to reiterate this live here, we talked about narcissistic fleas. Narcissistic fleas are when you start to behave a little bit like a narcissistic person. It's not the same as full-blown NPD. Not the same at all. But it happens because we become like the people we surround ourselves with. And it can also be a symptom of being in a trauma bond or cptsd. And depending on what that narcissistic person was like in your life, those are probably the behaviors you might start to display in your own life if you have narcissistic fleas. But the way through this is step 1, awareness. Do you have awareness that you're doing it? Because once you have awareness, then you can admit to yourself it's an issue, and then you can try your best to work on it. And how do you work on it? Well, you try to figure out for yourself when and where they come up in your life. Do they come up with certain people? Do they come up in certain situations? What is it? When you pinpoint that, then you'll be able to find the way through. And depending on what that part is, I might tell you something different. But a lot of it starts with us. Are we in a good mind, body, spirit place? When we are, we'll be most able to handle things in a healthy way. If we're not, and we're letting our demons get the best of us, we could fly off the rails. And it's like that Indian quote with the wolves, like, which wolf do you feed? The one that's good for your spirit or the one that's not so good? And that's the thing with all of the trauma bonds and narcissistic relationships. Those relationships are full of emotional withdrawals. And you have so many emotional withdrawals that the bank account is overdrawn. As opposed to a healthy relationship with a strong foundation, lots of emotional deposits, lots of connection. And when you have emotional deposits and connection, that's a good relationship. And you have a surplus. You got a surplus in your emotional bank account. But when there's emotional withdrawals and abuse and depletions, that's when you're emotionally bankrupt. And that's when the relationships are not in a good place at all. But that's something I go over with my coaching clients. Remember, the emotional deposits and the emotional withdrawals. But also, check out my course for clarity too. So if someone's like really confused after being in a trauma bond or any kind of toxic relationship, It's a course for clarity, just to help people clear up their confusion. It's a step between me and a coaching session. Like, it's something to do if you're not sure if a coaching session's for you, but you're confused. It's at a lower price point so you can try to understand it. And it's also going to be really helpful because I put a lot of effort into that. And it's like the basics. It's the basics of what might be happening and why you feel that way. So I go over a lot of the concepts about double standards, and if you match their actions, gaslighting, reactive abuse, etc. But it's really good. But with that, I think it's about time to wrap up here. It's almost time to hit the gym. But thank you for watching if you got this far. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you've noticed, I haven't been doing as many shorts recently. The shorts, I'm still doing them. They're just on other platforms. I'm putting them on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, not putting them on YouTube. Because shorts are good for YouTube for getting subscribers, but they're not so good for anything else, really. Because shorts viewers watch shorts generally. And I'm trying to get people to watch the longer form stuff here because that's where the business part is on YouTube. So if you want the more shorts, Jared Mello on Facebook, Wizard of Radical Self-Respect on Instagram, Wizard of Radical Self-Respect / Revenge of the Black Sheep on TikTok. So keep your eyes out for that too. But with that, that's all. Over and out.